Hello everyone and welcome to another Eclectic book diary. So for today's video I want to share all my most anticipated fantasy releases for June, July and August, so basically for summer. And this has nothing to do with like summer vibes, it just happens that these releases are within the summer months, but nothing more than that. All of these releases are fantasy releases, and to be completely honest, this video is completely for fun. I know for a fact that I don't have that much wiggle room when it comes to adding like new releases or anything like that. However, it just every time a new release comes to fruition, I just seem to have this anxious feeling of like I want to read this, and I feel like there are too many books and too little time, and I just figured maybe if I do a video like this where I share my most anticipated releases, it will just give me a little bit of joy, even though I wouldn't technically be reading them, however, at least for now, but I would get that stress release, I guess, just by sharing them and talking about them for a little while. And there are obviously so many new book releases every single month. However, I tried to pick my most anticipated releases based on what I generally feel like I would like, so it's genuinely just my opinion, obviously, and there are so many other releases that I am personally interested in. However, it would be redundant to mention them all. I figured maybe we could stick to a few, and for transparency reasons, these books are not going to be read anytime soon by me. I'm basically maxed out when it comes to which books I can read or I will be reading for the upcoming least couple to 3 months. However, since, as I said, I am thoroughly intrigued by so many releases, it would be a waste to not talk about any of them, and who knows, maybe I could sneak in some of those releases 1 month at a time, and hopefully I get to read them all at the end. I would do my best, I guess. So let's start with these releases. I tried to, as I said, narrow it down as much as possible, and I came out with 8 in the final list. So let's start with the June section first. First book on this list would be Driftwood Orphans by Paul Kruger. I think this book will be released in June 23rd, if I'm not mistaken, and this is supposed to be a standalone fantasy novel, which I'm super excited about. We don't get enough standalone fantasy books. I feel like most of the times the trajectory is for fantasy series or fantasy trilogies, things of that nature. It is supposed to be a story of revenge and vengeance with discussions around like friendships and greed, and all in all it's kind of a revenge story with a magical twist to it. So hopefully it will be one of the reads that I will get to very soon, and I'm quite interested about that. Obviously, I'm not gonna give that much information about all these books that I'm gonna mention. First of all, for very selfish reasons, because I don't want to read too much of whichever synopsis there is for any of these books. I do prefer to not know that much about the books going in. I like to know some information, but I don't want to know too much, if you know what I mean. So I hope that whichever small, brief discussion we have about these books in here would be enough to intrigue any of you who are watching, in case you want to read one of these books. So we'll see about that. I might add an additional information on the screen if I feel like it's not enough, but generally speaking, I think like keeping it as brief as possible is the way to go. I hope you agree. So let's move on to the second book on this list, and it's also supposed to be released in June. The book is called The Final Strife. It is supposed to be inspired by African and Arabian mythology. To be more specific, I believe Arabian and Ethiopian folklore. So we have three women in this story that will band together against this cruel empire that divides people by blood. As far as I understood from the synopsis that I've read, that red is for the elite and blue is for the poor, and then clear is for the slaves. I'm not quite sure if that's some literal thing within the book or if it's just metaphoric. Either way, it sounds super thrilling, and I want to know more, obviously. This book is supposed to be the first book in the Ending Fire trilogy, so this is an epic fantasy release, and it is, I think it has like a coming of age vibe to it as well, and probably a sense of adventure within it. So anyway, I'm super excited for this book and to see what it has within its pages. It's gonna be an adventure on its own, obviously. Now for book number 3 on this list, and we move to the July territory, we have Blood of the Chosen. Now this book kind of puts me in a weird position here, because this is not actually a standalone or a first installment in a series. This is the second book, I believe, of Burning Blade and Silver Eye trilogy, or what's supposed to be a trilogy. This is written by Django Wixler, and the first book is called Ashes of the Sun. I haven't read the first one. I didn't even know that the first one existed, to be completely honest. This is the first time I am hearing about this first book, and it was through me wanting to read the second one. Let's move back a little bit and talk a tiny bit about the first book. So this whole story is supposed to be a high fantasy. Some has described it as Arthurian romance, or it has some vibes of that. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. I know what Arthurian legend is, but this is supposed to be an Arthurian romance. I have no idea how to explain this. However, that's how some people described it, I guess. Now for the story, as far as I understood, there's like this magical war that happens that literally destroys this empire, and then another empire will be built on the older empire's ashes, I believe. And then we have two siblings that actually will be fighting against each other, or at least on opposite sides, and they will do anything in their power to protect their world. Now that on its own sounds very enticing, and I just feel that it will be very interesting to follow these two different perspectives. I don't know if the book will be just from these two perspectives, or if they will have other perspectives within it. However, I believe that that is on its own is a very interesting thing to see, and to see the development. And then we will move to the second book, which actually caught my eyes in the first place. I believe Blood of the Chosen will be released on July 27th of 2022, obviously. So yeah, I don't know if I will be able to read the first one and then read this one by the time it will be released, because as I said, I have a lot of books on my plate. And this is just like, I think something to remind myself of how much I like to read new releases as well. Like, I have a lot of books that I want to read that are not new releases by any means, and sometimes it's nice to see what's new, especially in the fantasy scene, because that is intriguing, I guess, and I love to see the development of the fantasy scene in general. So anyway, let's move on to the fourth book on this list before I keep on with the rambling. So the fourth book on this list is actually by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and it's called The Daughter of Dr. Moreo, and it is not technically a fantasy story. It's actually categorized as historical fiction slash scientific fiction. I was super excited about this specific book, so I thought maybe I could throw it in the mix as well. And since it's sci-fi, then it's like a close relative to fantasy, I guess, and it's not that far from the whole vibes of this video. However, this book is supposed to be released on July 19th, I believe, and it is, as I said, a sci-fi story with a historical fiction background. I believe the story is set in 19th century Mexico, and that's where the historical fiction part comes to play, and also the science fiction part is because we have a genius or maybe even a mad scientist that is making all of this experiment things and creating hybrids from both humans and animals. To be completely honest, I think that specific idea, it's both interesting but also a bit disturbing, and I'm quite curious to see how Silvia Moreno Garcia, the author, would handle this specific topic and how the presentation of that would be, because I do not want to see any animal cruelty. So it will be like these monster things, and I am a bit, as I said, concerned of how this will be handled, but at the same time I'm quite curious about that. If I started reading this specific story and it turns out that it has animal cruelty in it, it will be so unfortunate, and it would probably be a deal breaker. I would stop reading it immediately. I do not want to see that whatsoever. But I have read from people who have, I believe, gotten like arcs of this, that they were saying that there's nothing of that sort, even though there is like this monsters and hybrid topic that will involve animals, I believe, but the overall handling of the situation doesn't really contain animal cruelty of any sort. So I'm gonna stick to that hope and just like wait and see if that is the situation. Now the book itself is actually a reimagining or a retelling of another story that is called The Island of Dr. Moreo. I believe that's like an older story, and I have never read like the original source. However, I feel because this is like a reimagining with, I believe, a feminist twist to it, I am hoping that it will be like some sort of refreshing situation and making things a bit more forward thinking, even though we are kind of retelling something, and also it kind of will have like a historical fiction vibe overall. It will be interesting to see how this whole situation will be dealt with. Now, here is the story. I personally was interested and intrigued in this specific book because of the author herself. My first experience with this author was around 2 years ago, or maybe a little bit more or a little bit less. I have no idea. Time is such a strange concept right now, but regardless, a while back I was introduced to her from her very famous novel, and that would be Mexican Gothic. When I first heard of that story, I was super intrigued and excited, and it was super hyped back then. I believe it's still hyped, but especially when it was first released, it was really like super hyped, and I really got caught up in this hype trap, I believe. I think that made me super analytical or judgmental. It was a bit too much, to be honest. Like I was a bit too harsh. I had really high expectations for it, like extremely high expectations for it. And then when I read it, it just, for some reason, it felt a little bit short from what I expected. And I believe I judged it too harshly. I do think that the main thing that affected me the most was her writing style. And that thing got confirmed when I read another book by her, and that was The Beautiful Ones. And even though, again, that story wasn't really my favorite, but for some reason, her writing style really clicks with me. I feel like she got a way around words that works for me personally. I know that even though her stories, for now, these two books that I've read, they are not necessarily my favorite books of all time, but her writing style works so well with me personally, and it has such an easy flow to it. She has a way also of describing the atmosphere in whichever situation we are in, and you can like fully be immersed in that world. And I just I love her writing style personally, and for that I was super intrigued when I saw that there is a new release from her that is, again, it has that historical vibe to it, but it's not necessarily just historical fiction. And I feel like the last couple of books that I read by her also has like a historical vibe, but with a twist to it. So Mexican Gothic is a historical fiction. It's both historical fiction and a horror story. And then The Beautiful Ones is both a historical fiction and a romance novel, and it has a touch of fantasy, if I'm not mistaken. So it is always that historical fiction with a twist to it. So I'm always intrigued by that. I like historical fiction in general, specifically when it's combined by something else. It's something that I really like to indulge in, I guess. I'm hoping that this one will not only intrigue me from like her style of writing specifically, but also the story itself will be perceived better than the other stories. I'm not saying that the other two stories weren't perceived that well, but they weren't my favorites. And because of how much I like her writing style, I would love for all of the elements within the book to be as intriguing, I guess. So we'll see about that. And another thing I want to mention as well is about the covers on these books. I do not know if all her books have these covers, but the new cover for this specific release and the other two books that I've read from her, if you put them next to each other, they have the same vibe. You can easily detect that these are written at least by the same person, or I don't know, maybe they are being done by the same artist. Maybe that is the case, but whatever that may be, it's just a really great choice in my opinion. The vibes overall are my absolute favorite, and I feel like every one of them is literally like a piece of art on its own, regardless of the book itself. Just the covers of these are so stunning, and I thought I should mention that. It's one of my favorite covers in general, like the overall vibes, the colors, the richness of them. It has that surreal element about them, but still sometimes you can feel that realism within them at the same time. It's very intriguing to me. So as I said, I'm saying intriguing like 1,000 times per second, but regardless, I am really looking forward for this one. This will be probably one of the first choices I would make when it comes to reading any books from this list, because most of her books are not that long, and it would just be easy for me, or easier for me, to pick this one before picking any of the other ones, and probably easier to include this one within my reading schedule for the upcoming months, because as I said, it is really a full list. So adding any new books to the mix is not going to be an easy task to do, but it's not impossible. So hopefully I get to do that. Moving on to the fifth book, and we will be moving on also to the August releases, and that will be Daughter of Darkness by Elizabeth Kaur and Catherine Kaur. This book is supposed to be released on 4th of August, and it is a first installment of a new series called House of Shadows, and I believe this is inspired by Greek mythology, and this is a YA fantasy book. Most of my choices for this list were adult fantasy. However, I like reading YA fantasy from time to time. As I said, this is inspired by Greek mythology, and I do not know that much about this book, but the idea of having like something inspired by Greek mythology is intriguing enough for me. One of my favorite books of all time is Circe by Madeline Miller, and I feel like I'm always looking for a new favorite, I guess, when it comes to things that are inspired by Greek mythology. To be completely honest, I didn't read the full synopsis of this specific book. I don't know why. I read it is like a Greek mythology inspired, and I decided that I want to read it, and I didn't want to get further into any details. I usually prefer not to know that much about a story before I read it, but I usually read a little bit more than that to be intrigued. But in this case, I was, sign me up. I don't need to actually read more of the synopsis. I prefer to keep it as vague as possible for this one. I should say that most stories are better experienced right ahead without actually that many details given before. I know, genuinely speaking, you need to know just like bits and pieces about the overall thing that you are embarking on, but still sometimes it's very nice to just throw yourself into a story and not really know anything about it, except in this case we know that it's a Greek mythology inspired, but I am personally not gonna give you any details about the story itself, but I'm super interested in seeing what this story is gonna be about, and hopefully it will be something that I will treasure the same way I treasure like Circe, as I said, book Circe, because I read the Song of Achilles, and let me tell you, I know this might be controversial, but I did not really like that book that much, and I maybe even DNF'd the last few chapters of it. I couldn't continue. I was bored. I really like her style of writing, but I couldn't continue. And it was really weird because I read Circe first and I absolutely loved it, and I thought I would feel the same for the Song of Achilles, but it turns out that that wasn't the situation. So I hope that this book will be on the lines of Circe, not the other book. And even though it's written by completely different authors, obviously, however, for comparison reason, I'm just trying to give you a bigger picture, I guess, for how I feel. So I hope that will be another hit. That's what I'm trying to say, not another flop for me personally. Just want to make that clear. Now let's move on to the next book on the list, and that will be The Art of Prophecy by Wesley Chu. I believe this is an epic fantasy novel. If I'm not mistaken, it's also also another standalone. And it has like that vibes of like The Chosen One, but with a twist to it. Apparently with these kind of stories, like prophecy stories, we have the chosen one who has to eliminate the enemy and save the kingdom or whatever, and eventually fulfilling his ultimate destiny. However, for this story, there is like a twist, and we gotta find out that the prophecy is actually wrong. So perhaps we will get to follow the stories of many unexpected heroes, which sounds really amazing on its own, like to follow up so many different perspectives and to not be focused just on the chosen one situation, but it's still like a part of the story. Like we have that thing, that prophecy, that chosen one, which will be, as I said, like a part of the overall journey, but we will have so many other intricate and very important pieces to the puzzle overall that things will not be focused on just this specific aspect of the story, which again sounds pretty awesome. I'm quite excited about it, just like the other releases, and this one will probably be a great candidate whenever I feel like I want to read a fantasy standalone, but I have other options within this list itself to choose from, but this is probably would be like on the top of the list as well. I feel like I've been saying that for every single book on this list. Sounds awesome. Anywho, let's move on. Now for book number 7, we have The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simone Geminist. This is an epic fantasy novel, but again, it's supposed to be, I believe, a standalone book. Or that's what I think it is. Now, this is one of the stories that I would prefer to read the synopsis, for example. I believe this is expected to be released on the 30th of August, so really late in August. But as I said, this whole story is better recognized by the synopsis itself. It says, "The people suffer under the centuries-long rule of the Moon Throne. The royal family, the despotic emperor and his monstrous sons, the three terrors, hold the countryside in their shocking grip. They bleed the land and oppress the citizens with the frightful powers they inherited from the god locked under the palace. But that god cannot be contained forever. With the aid of June, a guard broken by his guilt-stricken Bast, and Kima, an outcast fighting for his future, the god escapes from her royal captivity and flees from her own children, the triplet terrors who would drag her back to her unholy prison. And so it is that she embarks with her young companions on a 5-day pilgrimage in search of freedom and a way to end the Moon Throne forever. The journey ahead will be more dangerous than any of them could have imagined. Both a sweeping adventure story and an intimate exploration of identity, legacy, and belonging, The Spear Cuts Through Water is an ambitious and profound saga that will transport and transform you and is like nothing you have ever read before." It seems epic. It seems that the story itself is gonna be very enticing, and so yeah, I feel like this will be a good choice if I want to follow a new or start a new series. Hopefully I will get to read it one day. Yeah, now for the last book on this list, and that will be The Dragon's Promise by Elizabeth Lynn. And this is the second book of Six Crimson Crane. I believe it's supposed to be a duology, and I have read the first book last year when it first launched, and it was one of my most anticipated YA releases of that year, to be honest, and I quite enjoyed it. It was a very light-hearted but yet very emotional type of a story. We have this young girl who has like some sort of a magic in her blood that she's trying to hide. When her stepmother realizes that, she kind of curses her to not be able to speak, and she curses her brothers and turns them into cranes, and if she tries to speak, one of her brothers will be killed. And she sends her away from the palace, and now she has to find a way not only to break the curse but also to generally just survive with her like not being able to speak and all. And it's very interesting to follow her journey, even though she can't talk per se and she has to navigate around that, but we are following her journey, and it's really powerful how the author was capable to make you feel all the things that she's going through and explain the scenes through her eyes and tell you of the overall situation, with her not being, for the most part I would say, not being able to communicate with like words and all of that. So it was very, very nice to see that, and I thought it was like a super cute story overall, and it was fun just reading that. And YA in general tend to be a lot easier to grasp. I do like to read YA from time to time just for the fact that YA layout in general is much easier to follow, and this is one of the cases that it's very adorable, and I really wanted to see how things will progress, so that's what we will follow in the next installment of the story. So hopefully this whole thing will wrap up in a cohesive way, and I will still feel like the same way, I guess, that I felt about the first one with the second one. And yeah, that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you find this type of content interesting, feel free to subscribe, and I hope you're having a wonderful day or evening whenever you're watching this, and I also hope you will join me on the next one. Until then, take care. Bye bye.